thanks for joining me this morning, Jeff. I'm pretending to be at this amazing vision that you have for the blast furnace. But first of all, can you just introduce yourself and tell me a little bit about what you're trying to do to save our heritage?
Yeah. Okay. Well, good morning to you, Lisa. Start from the beginning then. I was born and brought up on Teesside. I went to sea for 10 years to get a master's certificate and then came ashore to be a pilot on the River Tees. And I did that for 32 years, got involved in both the admin side of that and international pilotage. And so sort of spread the wings a little bit in that respect. But always one of my real interests has been heritage, history, local heritage. And one particular branch of it was to start a local history group for Kirkby, Great Broughton, Ingleby, Greenhow. We did that as soon as I retired, and that's been really successful. We've published a number of articles. We got a national award, regional award, and that got me into researching and developing a project on the North York Moors called Land of Iron. We were fortunate to get over £3 million from the National Heritage Lottery Fund, with which we have restored and conserved various elements of ironstone mining and rail transport across the top of the North York Moors. So that's the Battersby Incline and all that kind of stuff. So that was between 10 and 15 million tonnes of ironstone roasted to become iron ore. And that in turn led, when the end of iron making came about in 2015, to thoughts about how we could do something to preserve the heritage of what had been essentially the history of Teesside. Middlesbrough is only there because of the coal initially, and then the ironstone and the then iron and steel making industry. And it was huge. It was 30% of Britain's iron production. At one time, the northeast of England was producing 20% of the world's iron and steel. Really huge in global terms. So it seemed to me it was ending with a whimper, and we needed to do something to try and bring a small bang there. So I had a good friend who'd been chief exec of Middlesbrough, and he put me in touch with the elected mayor, Dave Budd. And between ourselves, we formed a group. That group was called Tees Steel Bridging the World. I chose the title for a number of reasons. Bridges are the opposite of walls. Bridges join people, walls separate them. And Teesside has been famous for many of the bridges that it has produced in the past, which have not only formed icons in their own cities, as on the Tyne and Sydney, but also actually we were the first to join two continents. The Europe and Asia were joined with a bridge from Teesside, and that was an extraordinary achievement. And it gainsays those people who say, oh, that's gone and passed, we've got to move on. Yes, we have got to move on, but we shouldn't allow these things to disappear. So part of that project, Tees Steel Bridging the World, was coming into contact with Pat and Pete McCarthy, who have developed something called The Art of Steel, and it's basically a compendium, if you like, or a virtual gallery of artwork about iron and steel making, and they're very good at that. So that was going to be one specific stream of our project, Tees Steel Bridging the World. But we then moved on, were able to get funding, a modest sum, to produce a business plan. And that business plan was predicated upon redevelopment of heritage on the Tees Works site. It's now called Tees Works. At that time, it was called the South Tees Development Corporation. It's a huge site, and there is room to have both heritage there, as well as lots and lots of new green energy jobs. So we did that, and we were successful insofar as the South Tees Development Corporation master plan mentioned in various elements the retention of heritage assets. So we were delighted with that. and we were ready to move forward. But unfortunately, because the land wasn't owned by the Development Corporation at that time, they were still fighting with SSI banks, it was difficult to move forward. In the interim, Redcar and Cleveland Council, through their chief exec, Amanda Skelton, developed a separate project. We became marginally involved with that, called Steel Stories. That produced a wonderful exhibition at Kirkleatham Museum. Very, very successful, but kind of short term. So then we tried to build on that, but unfortunately Amanda was made redundant, and we weren't able to develop that. We pitched already to Redcar and Cleveland Council. But in the elections, everything changes. So we had to move into a new and different tomorrow. So that was, in essence, where we were at until 2.5 months ago, when Ben Houchen announced the plans to demolish all the structures on the Tees Work site. And clearly then that was a marker in the sand for us. I sent a long and rather passionate email to Ben Houchen saying, you know, we needed to look at retaining in particular the blast furnace. We felt it was terribly important, because what they want to do is focus the heritage element on the Dorman Long Coaling Tower, which is a brutalist modern concrete structure. It's got Dorman Long on the side, so it speaks eloquently of the heritage, but it's not iron making. It was a coal handling tower. So we feel it's really important to try and keep the blast furnace, and that's where our efforts are focused at the moment. There were various plans and thoughts about how we could do that, but one thing which is very clear is that Ben Houchen and many of his cohort are missionary about creating new jobs and sustainable jobs, and rightly so, on the Tees Work site. But nevertheless, it's 4,500 acres, so there is room for both. So we realized, because of that task that they have, that we needed to restrict our ambitions to the simple retention of a stripped down core structure. We couldn't build a park as happens in Germany, because we wouldn't be given the land, because being given the land there would remove the possibility of industrial jobs. But there is an area adjacent to the blast furnace, and this is where perhaps we have a link with arts. That area is designated for community benefit. So if we are able to be successful in retaining the blast furnace as a core structure, as an icon, both reflecting the past and bouncing into the future, signaling the future, if we're able to do that, then there is the potential to have it as a focus on that adjacent land on Cotham Sands, and perhaps do some art-enabled visionary work there. I suggested a couple of things that we might just think about. That's off the top of my head. There are far more creative people about than me who could figure ways to join the green energy of the future into the iron making of the past, and replicate that with imaginative structures, and to use it also as an educational resource for young people who will not know, will not remember the tens of thousands of people who went to work along the banks of the River Tees, making iron and steel, creating structures which are all around the world now. So that gets us to where we are now, I guess.
Well, that's absolutely incredible vision that you have there, Jeff. I think that kind of project is the sort of thing that you would pay an artist a hell of a lot of money to come in and design from scratch as a monument. And the fact that it's already there, it only needs to be saved. It encapsulates all of that history, as you say, brilliant for all the new green jobs. It's exactly what we need. But to have a reminder of the past in the middle of that, I think would be very moving. And it sounds like we need to get a lot of community impetus around this. I think, raise awareness of what you're doing. And as you say, let's maybe see what artists we can do a shout out to come up with ideas of look, it's an incredible place. It must be saved.
It's one of the analogies, if you like, is the yellow sticker that you see in supermarkets, which is when it's gone, it's gone. And people think, oh yeah, well, I'll get that next time I'm around. And then of course, the next time they go, it has gone and it won't ever come back again. And it's the way of signaling that. Now, if I had a big yellow label right now, a big yellow Post-it note, I'd stick it on the blast furnace. And maybe we should think about that as one of the ways of trying to save it. Because everything on the Teesworks site has to go through a process. It's understandable why that process is there. The process involves finding out what it costs to have that industry there, how many jobs it will create, how much input was required, and then how much ongoing maintenance. And we're not that. We're not new jobs specifically, but we do, I believe, have the creative capacity, the inspirational capacity to make this site, to give it a world-class icon, something different and unique, a USP such as nowhere else in the UK has really. But the problem is, of course, it's not terribly old. So it's difficult to get it listed or even scheduled, or we haven't gone down that track yet, but we are looking at it. And we need Ben and Jacob and these young people who've been elected to high office in the area to recognise that, you know, before they were even got into nappies, these things were vibrant, and active, and creating wealth, and deserve remembrance and deserve the tribute that the future can pay to the past, because it helps energize, it helps give confidence, it helps people understand that where they are is somewhere which did things and can do things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, so many of the interviews that I've conducted with people in the local area that are now involved in the creative arts, whose parents, you know, were involved in all of these industries in some ways or another. They're like, you know, sons and daughters of steel workers, of coal miners, of iron workers. And I think they, you know, it's not just about holding on to that history for the sake of the people that were involved in it, but because it's a huge part of the story of the local area. You know, I didn't even know about, I had a walk with a local historian, JT, who was telling me about, you know, I didn't even know there was a dock in Middlesbrough. I didn't know why it was there. You know, I didn't know the history of the Stockton-Darlington Railway and really how that was kind of, you know, a kind of plaything until there was the dock at Middlesbrough, which, you know, that's what put the railways to work.
Yeah.
And this idea of Middlesbrough having, you know, it's fallen and risen many times. It's had a focus and that's gone, and something new's come in. And at the moment it looks like digital and green is what's coming in, which is fantastic. But we also need to recognise that it's had this incredible past that I don't think has been celebrated well enough as it is. Yeah. And I think something like this kind of monument, and as you say, the Dorman Long building together could you know, keep that history and get it more widely known.
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with Anish Kapoor's sculpture or the Angel of the North. But the reality is that Redcar Blast Furnace is actually far more relevant to the area than either of those two structures. And they're applauded as being, you know, great artworks. We have one on our doorstep, which belongs to us. It relates to us. It's relevant to us. It means something. And that's why I get very frustrated when people talk about, even elected councillors, unfortunately, are very rude about it, and they call it a pile of old pipes and, you know, rusting hulk, etc. Well, I'm sorry, but it is far more than that. There were dozens and dozens and dozens of blast furnaces. And one thing that's little remembered now is that Teesside actually led the world in blast furnace technology. And I can remember in my youth, there were offices for people like Priest Furnaces in Middlesbrough. I didn't know why they were there. I knew they had posh brass nameplates outside, but it was because we were world leaders in blast furnace technology. And when you talk about Middlesbrough Dock, I mean, I used to take ships in and out of there, of course. And that was quite an exciting exercise as well, because the ships that were coming in were virtually the size of the entrance. And yeah, there's some good stories about those things. So yeah, and I think it's really important that we retain the industrial heritage iconic artifacts as far as we can, not, as you say, purely to celebrate, but also to give confidence and for people, it's a little bit like you talk to world-class athletes today, and they will talk about who their inspirational models were. So somebody like Jessica Ennis would talk about the previous heptathlon world record holder, who was a Brit, whose name's gone out of my head right now, but that is the kind of inspiration that they take. They see what someone else has achieved and they're determined to drive towards it. But when you look at that blast furnace, if you can encapsulate it in a particular way, you can use it to say, gosh, you know, actually, we can do this carbon capture, we can do this hydrogen power, we can, you know, we are a place that actually achieves these things and utilize it in a positive energy way.
Yeah, absolutely. As I understand it, it was, you know, it was a long time in development, the blast furnace, and it was particularly because the kind of iron that we had in the local hills wasn't readily made into steel without that technology. So it was, you know, it was a couple of years of not giving up, being determined to make the best of, you know, make the best use of what we have here. And that absolute determined, you know, eventually resulted in this massive steel industry.
And you never know what the spin-offs are, Lisa. One story which is little known, I tell stories about the history of the River Tees. One story that's little known is that when we got into lots and lots of blast furnaces, they were very inefficient at the start. They made a lot of slag and they didn't know what to do with the slag. So the ironmasters said to the port, look, we can't keep dumping this stuff. It's, even in those days, health and safety, it was horrible stuff. We need to get rid of it. And the ironmaster and the port said, well, be expensive to move that lot, you know, so we'll have to come to a deal. And they came to a deal back in the 1860s, and they were paid 4p a tonne, which was a lot of money in those days, to cart it away, because there were thousands and thousands of tonnes. And the ironmasters, of course, assumed they would take it away and dump it at sea. Not so. The port owners were smart enough to realise that the river, which was huge, marshy, a great sort of plain, that could be changed. And they built training walls, 22 miles of training walls along the River Tees, so that the river could only then travel between those walls for most of the tidal period. What that did was it stopped the water from dropping its silt that it was bringing from upriver onto the bottom of the riverbed, carried it out to sea. Effectively, the river dredged itself from a depth of 6 to 22 feet 6. And as a result of that, the river became possible for the port to carry ships in 10 times as large as previously. But it was done with the slag that was the waste product. So you don't know what's going to come in the future. It was then used for road making slag or all that kind of thing. So there's all kinds of spin-offs from doing things. And if we do this positive effort, and we're able to keep these things, they will in turn produce positive results into the future, which we can't quantify now, but we'll thank ourselves for in the future.
Jeff, I can't agree more. It's absolutely fantastic. I will help you, support you in your work in any way that I can. I'll definitely put a call out to artists to get on board with this project and see what we can envision. It's been fantastic to talk to you, and thanks so much for that. That was a really great herald. I hope people answer the call.
Very good. Thank you very much indeed, Lisa. Good to talk to you. Enjoyed that.
Take care.
Take care.
Yeah, me too.
Cheers. Bye.